Mr. Asif Saeed Memon from SDPI, who will chair this session. The two presentations for this session will be Dr. Prasanthi Gunawardene and from Jayawardenepura University, and Kanchana Wickramasinghe from the Institute of Policy Studies, as well as we have three discussants, Dr. Indrajith Coomaraswamy, Mr. Deshal and Ms. Tharuka Dissanaike. Please take your seats. I believe Wi-Fi is also working, so you should be able to log on now.
Welcome everybody. I hope everybody had a nice tea break. My name is Asif. I'm a student fellow at SDPI. The second session is about economic growth within natural limits. Continuing on from our previous discussion, I'll take a brief time to just lay out some positions on the issue.
Your mic is not working.
Sorry.
It's on.
Hello, welcome again from your tea break. My name is Asif Memon. The second session is on economic growth within natural limits. I am an associate fellow at Sustainable Development Policy Institute in Islamabad. Our two presenters are Dr. Prasanthi Gunawardene from the University of Sri Jayawardenepura and Ms. Wickramasinghe from the Institute of Policy Studies here in Colombo. And our three discussants joining us today are Dr. Indrajith Coomaraswamy, Mr. Deshal. My apologies if I'm butchering any of these names. And Ms. Tharuka Dissanaike. I hope I got those correct. If we could get this presentation up there. Yeah. Thank you. The goal for me today is to establish the discussion on economic growth. And I'm trying to take an economist's perspective on this. Not necessarily always the most popular view, and it's been called the dismal science for good reason as well. But the basic argument behind economic growth is a good thing, is that it is a rising tide that lifts all boats. And we've been hearing this argument from economists for the past 50 years or more. There is some evidence that this might be correct if by all boats we mean the percentage of the population living below the poverty line. So a definition of poverty that is with regards to absolute poverty and an income-based definition of poverty. There is lots of evidence over the last 20 years that a number of large developing emerging market countries or countries that have gone from developing status or low income status to, as Pre pointed out, low middle income or upper middle income status have lifted lots of their population above a predetermined poverty line. China and India are often quoted as an example for this. But of course there are others, Brazil and so on. So from that perspective, the economists might be right. If we look at the case of South Asia over the last decade, this is data from the World Bank. My apologies, the countries are not labeled on here. We can play a game of where you guess which country is which. If we look at this, on the y-axis we have a change in Gini coefficient over the last 7 or 8 years, and on the x-axis we have GDP growth. And what we have seen is a reduction in relative poverty, so the Gini coefficient has gone down in many countries. But interestingly enough, it doesn't seem to have a positive relationship in this case with economic growth. So for example, the two countries above the zero on the x-axis have high economic growth rates, but they've not seen decreases in Gini coefficients. They've actually seen increases in relative poverty. And other countries who have lower growth rates over the last decade have seen reductions in poverty. So the question is, what does that show us? Is it showing us an increase or a reduction in poverty? Is there a relationship, or is there not? So the evidence on this is mixed, as shown by this graph. There have been lots of critiques of this obsessive sort of pursuit of economic growth, defined almost always as national income or GDP per capita. The critiques have been about it doesn't take into account income inequality, it doesn't take into account what we now consider multidimensional poverty, issues of education, health, status of women, and it doesn't take into consideration environmental issues, the natural limits of the endowment that every country enjoys, the natural endowment that every country enjoys, what impact it's having on the climate overall, and how it's affecting our future potential for growth. In each case, the brigade of economists has come up with a response of a sort. My apologies if some of this is using some technical languages, but one of the arguments has been made by economists that actually you will see an increase in inequality as you move from an agrarian society towards an industrial society, as you effectively harness natural resources, increase production. Simultaneously with increases in income, you will see increased consumption, which will see increase in the use of natural resources. But eventually, as incomes get beyond a certain point, environmental degradation or inequality will come down. As people, as Pri pointed out, as the benefits of economic growth begin to trickle down to the lower income brackets of society, the inequality curve will essentially be an inverse U. It will go up and then it will come down. As highlighted earlier, the Millennium Development Goals, although not framed within the economic model of growth, were in a way a response to this obsession about economic growth. And the discussion was about how do we incorporate other aspects, and it included education, health, status of women, and the environment, as well as more multidimensional poverty indicators were developed. Coming to what we are discussing with regards to the perspective of the economy and the environment. This is an example of a graph that's been posited by a number of economists who look at environmental policy. And they argue that over time, as per capita income increases, the environment degrades to a certain point, but beyond that, it starts improving. The question is this data, does the data support this theory? Does the data support this hypothesis? The findings show that as incomes increase, the environment does degrade. This is true for China. Increasingly, it's true for India and all across South Asia, actually. The World Bank in a recent report estimates that it costs environmental degradation as a direct outcome of economic growth costs India about 5.7% of their GDP. So in this graph, what the data shows is that the upward part of the graph is supported by the data. The environment does degrade as the economy grows. But once again, looking at South Asia, we don't see a relationship between GDP per capita and South Asia's performance on the Environmental Performance Index, which is calculated at Yale University. What we find is in fact, the linkage might be a U-shaped curve instead of an inverse U curve. The question then is, and I'll wrap up after this, we know that natural resources are limited. We cannot continue to hold the assumptions that economists did 40 years ago, 30 years ago, that natural endowments are exogenous to the calculation of economic growth. They are depleting, they are declining. We talk about peak oil, we talk about dwindling water resources. We've seen food price hikes because of dwindling food supply. We've seen droughts in certain parts of the world, which has resulted in reduced rice production or wheat production. But also we've seen the overuse of land resulting in lower productivity to produce these things. So the question, as pointed out in the previous section, is there a trade-off between not allowing natural resources to degenerate to deplete, and economic growth, inclusive economic growth? Are we harming our own citizens by making sure, by placing the climate and placing natural resources and natural endowments at a higher level? And the response to this question has to do with how we think, what we think about one last factor that I think needs to be brought into this discussion is technological growth. Back in the 18th century, British scholar named Malthus proposed that the world will see a drastic reduction in population because the current natural resources and land and agricultural production cannot support the population growth rate that we're seeing. He was unfortunate in the sense that he was writing this or saying this just before the Industrial Revolution came about. Once again, in the mid-20th century, we were also talking about mass famines, the possibility of millions of people dying from hunger, and we had the Green Revolution. So is there a technological revolution around the corner? Should we rely on that it will protect us from our constant increase in consumption, constant increase in production, or is this going to be the time when we're going to be, our inductive reasoning is going to fall apart? Though that's how I'd like to frame our session today. And we can begin now with our first presenter, Dr. Prasanthi Gunawardene.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My task today is to discuss few issues related to the economic growth within the nature's limits. I'm focusing on the need for this and the issues related to that. Basically, this will be the outline I'm following. As mentioned by the previous speaker, the growth has been considered as a panacea for many of the problems. For example, poverty eradication and reducing unemployment, overpopulation, and in order to reduce the environmental degradation. And previous speaker also, criticized, for example, using this environmental Kuznets curve. This is a myth. I would not go into the details, but this is the current, drive for the growth because it provides us solutions. But if you look at the consequences of unlimited growth or the requirements of this growth, because there are two linkages between an economy and environment, because economy does not exist in an isolation. It requires two flows from the environment. Although the arrows show up and down, but both flows are towards the economy from the environment. One thing is resources that supplies that is provided by the environment, and the other one is the waste emissions to the environment. So if we had what you call this unlimited supply of natural resources and unlimited waste absorption capacities, yes, of course, we can have unlimited growth. Let me briefly talk about the need for the limitation of the growth within the nature's limit. People think this as an option, but it could be a must. Let me focus. So there are a few physical principles I may wanted to highlight here. One thing is this, the two views held by the neoclassical economist and the so-called ecological economist on the two sustainability angles. Main focus was on the substitutability between the natural and the man-made capital. The neoclassical economist thought that future people will be richer than us. So it is therefore justifiable to deplete the natural capital and build adequate substitute human-made capital, because you count them both in the same scale. So either natural capital or human-made capital, so you are still in the same, you are still gaining. But from the ecological economist's perspective, they have taken this strong sustainability viewpoint where they have mentioned that certain amount of critical minimum natural capital should be maintained, and because the uniqueness of those environmental components and certain critical environmental processes like climate change cannot be reversed. So therefore they define what you call this strong sustainability rules. So let me emphasize on these 3 rules briefly. They have 3 rules. One for the renewable resources, where the rate of use should not be greater than the rate of regeneration. For the non-renewable resources, the rate of use should not be greater than the rate at which renewable resources is substitute for it. For example, if you deplete the oil resource, you should have produced an equivalent amount of renewable resource which could replace that. The third one is the rate of waste emission. It has to be within the assimilative capacity of the environment. But also we have to understand that there are certain waste that are not assimilated by the environment. We talk about, Sri Lankan situation, a lot of this contamination with the heavy metals, persistent organic pollutants, nuclear waste, and emissions from burning fossil fuels. So environment does not have any capacity to absorb any single molecule of burning of the fossil fuels, according to the climate scientist. So, what is the economic dimension of this unlimited growth? If you focus on the consequences on the violation of the rules I mentioned earlier, the resultant economy will be an uneconomical growth. For example, if you carry out any activity beyond these limits, the incremental benefit you will be getting will be less than the additional cost. So, why we are not seeing this? But because these are appearing in kind of an indirect way. For example, you will see that the environment is being degraded and the resources are being impoverished. Ecosystem services will be impaired. You can see the increases in the health expenditure. Mitigatory and defensive expenditures are rising. So therefore you will realize, we count this as positive like in our growth. So that is the mistake. But these are actually the rules, sustainability rule violation appear as this kind of symptoms. For example, Sri Lankan example, if you take very briefly the per capita solid waste generation increase, vehicle emission increase, visitations to recreation site, this has been cited as a positive thing, but it indicates the stresses in the urban environment. You just can imagine in a busy, long weekend, why the Colombo people are running to the outskirts. And it also indicates the use beyond the carrying capacities of those natural environment. We have seen recently many incidences. And also the depletion of natural habitats. For example, Sri Lankan rate is something like 5,000 hectares per year. The other problem is actually this kind of uneconomic growth is not shown in the markets because many ecosystem services are not traded. Climate stabilization, water regulation, waste absorption, and these have no price. So there is no feedback. The so-called market feedback is not there to produce them. So let me show you a few of the examples related to Sri Lanka, the damage cost and the unsustainable consumption. These are not shown in the market, but estimated using various valuation methods. The damage cost of pesticides imported to Sri Lanka in 2007, 10,000 million rupees. Fisheries, our coastal fishery contributes to 91% of the total fish production, and the fish catch has exceeded the sustainable yield by 11,000 in 2002. But unfortunate thing is that the value of this catch, which is about 113,000 million, appeared as a gain in our GDP. Cost of export processing zones in terms of loss of productive land, global warming damage, water pollution, hydrological and soil impacts, nearly 200,000 rupees million. Power projects, 3 power projects are compared, the runoff river type, dams and long tunnel and dam, the 3 different projects. You can see the per unit, the initial year per unit cost is quite significant. The other issue with the uneconomic growth is this is shown positively in the national accounts, and other main issue is that uneconomic growth is beneficial to certain groups who are exploiters and the polluters. But unfortunate thing is the cost related to the uneconomic growth usually borne by the poorest of the current generation, future generations, and the non-humans. The social dimensions related to the unlimited growth, because we believe that, it's a fact that the limited resource of the earth have to be shared equally for the basic needs of all. So that is the question mark, whether we accept that or not. But how about the future generations and the non-human beings? The humans are just one single species on this earth. Under the normal economic decision making or the cost benefit context, resource used by the current wealthy humans are easily justified than for unborn and non-humans, because economics is a science or the science for the current, present human beings. So the other aspect related to this social part of the growth is that growth always will not increase the happiness, the famous Eastern Indian paradox, or the utility or the well-being will not be increased with the increased growth. So, just few numbers in relation to Sri Lankan water utilization. One of the goals in MDG, the safe drinking water, percentage households with the drinking water from unsafe sources. You can see the western province is much better, but I'm trying to compare the owners of the resources versus the users of the resources. Yeah. And you can see the central province is the owners of the water resources in the country, but they are deprived of this, the water they are producing themselves. And households percentage with not sufficient drinking water, this is a serious situation, 15%. So looking at the literature about these planetary boundaries related to these limits to growth, that there were literature about the world have crossed certain boundaries in relation to climate change, biodiversity loss, and the biogeochemical flow, which means actually any kind of a small increment in the greenhouse gases may produce a very large disaster. The response is the global warming. We have exceeded the limits with regard to climate change, biodiversity loss, and the biogeochemical flows. We are talking about a small island like Sri Lanka and the local impacts of our own greenhouse gas emissions, like the previous speaker mentioned, versus the global impacts. So we really have to think about seriously about what is the fair share for ourselves. So the adjustments needed, we may have to think about the worse off group rather than the better off groups in the society. We may have to produce the longer lived, more durable products. We have to produce what the poor needs, clothing, shelter, and food on the plate rather than the luxury items. There has to be regulated trade among the nations that were equally committed to sustainability, because with the exporting or the trading, we are exporting the sustainability. So the tax, we have to tax the throughput flow, because whenever you are taking something from the biosphere, on that particular point you have to put the tax. Finally, we have to design our institutions and policies that will enable economies to attain sustainable development. Perhaps not just economics, but we may have to think about religious, ethical, whatever pluralistic dimensions in making the decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gunawardene, for that very, very enlightening presentation. I think we'll complete the presentations and then take questions. So I'll invite Ms. Wickramasinghe for her presentation.
Thank you. My title is on, the presentation is based on sustainable production and consumption. And I'm talking about the service sectors and taking the tourism sector as an example. And I think Mr. Memon and Dr. Prasanthi has given a comprehensive introduction to the issues in regard to economic growth and environmental issues. So this is an example from the tourism sector about sustainable production and consumption. So we have been discussing about this by 2015, this should be 15 actually, the MDGs are going to expire. So after 2015, what are we going to have? So there have been different discussions. Are we going to have a new set of development goals, or are we going to have sustainable development goals, or a mix of it? Anyway, we will be definitely having a set of goals. What should be there in terms of sustainable development? Just looking at the Millennium Development Goals, there have been several discussions on this. Some say that the MDG's focus, major focus is on social dimension, and not enough attention was paid on inequality issues, and particularly environmental sustainability aspects have not received enough attention. We had one goal on environment, a set of targets, but the consensus is that the important environmental problems have not been addressed by the MDGs. So what are we going to be like, what is going to be there after 2015? According to the resolutions by the United Nations General Assembly in 2012, there's a phrase called, we recognize that poverty eradication, change in unsustainable and promoting sustainable patterns of consumption and production, and protecting and managing the natural resource base of economic and social development are the overarching objectives of and essential requirements for sustainable development. So my focus is on this sustainable consumption and production. According to UNEP, the definition of SCP, it's a holistic approach which considers the use of resources and resulting impacts on the environment in terms of waste, emissions, etc. And also, very importantly, promote inclusive well-being. So it's not about just considering on the environmental aspects, but it includes the component of inclusive well-being. So what are the benefits of sustainable consumption and production? Obviously, there are environmental benefits, and if the corporate sector or private sector or a particular agent is practicing SCP, it increases the competitiveness. And due to resource efficiencies, it reduced costs of production. So at the end of the day, SCP in general helps to decouple growth from environmental degradation. SCP in the tourism sector, I have just highlighted S and P because I'm looking this from supply side, the production side, but since this is a service sector, since production and consumption are taking place at the same time, we can add C also into this discussion. As we all know, tourism consumes energy, water, and generates waste. And according to the statistics from the UNWTO, there have been bright prospects in regard to tourism in the South Asia region, particularly in Sri Lanka after the end of war. When you compare the tourist arrivals in Sri Lanka before the end of war and just after the end of war, in 2011, the arrivals have been doubled. So it shows that we have a significant progress in terms of tourist arrivals. And in the tourism sector, environmental sustainability is a critical factor which gives the business a competitive advantage. So the objectives of this presentation is to assess the degree of environmental orientation in the hotel sector in Sri Lanka, to identify the determinants and find out the driving factors and constraints. This is actually based on an ongoing study of IPS, which is funded by the South Asian Network for Development and Environmental Economics, and based on key informant interviews and data from a hotel survey, which includes 56 registered hotels in the Western Province. So it involves a descriptive analysis and also a probit model to identify the determinants of environmental orientation. So one of the major important thing in this regard is how to measure the environmental orientation, not only in the tourism sector, but also in other industries or maybe in other economic sectors, how to measure the environmental orientation. So while going through the literature and through key informant interviews, I came up with 4 indicators. First one is maintenance of environmental records, whether the hotels are maintaining proper records on environmental aspects, which may include energy, water, and waste. Without those records, you cannot find out where you are in terms of your environmental management, and you can't set targets, and monitoring is not allowed. Involvement in relevant projects and programs. There have been several projects and programs promoting sustainable tourism, and if hotels are getting involved in these programs, we can consider it that they are environmentally conscious. Environmental awards is a direct measure of environmental performance and presence of environmental management systems. So these indicators may not explain the environmental orientation of the hotels 100%, but it gives some sort of an indication. In terms of environmental records, in my sample, around only 37% of the hotels are maintaining proper records. And the possibility of maintaining, the likelihood of maintaining records is increasing with the size of the hotels, and the chain affiliated hotels are more likely to maintain records. In relation to involvement in relevant projects and programs, 31% hotels are involved. And again, the size of the larger hotels and the chain affiliated hotels are having a high likelihood of getting involved. And location, basically the city hotels are showing a high likelihood. Same determinants apply to environmental awards also. 29% of the sample have received environmental awards. And in relation to environmental management systems, it's only 27% who are having EMS. It's again size, chain affiliation, and location, which are the determinants of these factors. So looking at the motivations, why hotels are going for environmental management, or why are they being environmentally oriented? First reason is cost reduction due to increased resource efficiency. And second, because they want to get a market advantage. This is very important in the case of tourism sector. And maybe due to influence of competitors. Constraints, which is very important to look at. According to the importance of, by percentage, space constraints, and the perception that costs will be higher than the benefits, lack of financial resources, environmental management is not a top priority, and lack of technical know-how. So just to give you some insights as to what would be the constraints if we are going to incorporate these things. And I have highlighted the second and fifth constraints. So those are the most significant constraints in the small hotels. perception that the cost will be higher and lack of technical know-how. And some conclusions and insights based on this analysis. We could see that a significant proportion of hotels do not maintain records. So without having proper records, as I mentioned before, we cannot do anything. Large hotels are more environmentally oriented, maybe because due to economies of scale, or they have proper networks, so they are more capable of doing that. But what about the small hotels? And also, it's very important that we create awareness both among the public as well as the industry or the other economic sectors on the adoption of SCP in order to increase accountability. So that is very important for the industries like this. And this also calls for the need of having a comprehensive set of indicators to measure the environmental orientation and how the SCP objectives can be achieved. So with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wickramasinghe, on that presentation. Once again, very informative and interesting. We'll quickly move on to the discussion section. I'll invite Dr. Coomaraswamy to begin.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to address 3 issues in my presentation. First, the importance of growth. Second, rising inequality. And very briefly, it's going to be brief because I don't know very much about the subject, that is promoting synergies and avoiding trade-offs between the compulsions of growth and natural resource limits. On the importance of growth, now, I hope at the end that you don't come to the conclusion that this guy is just an unreconstructed growth junkie. I hope I'm not that, but I do come from a finance ministry central bank background, so it is possible that I am just that. But my concern really is that the pendulum should not swing too far the other way. And in fact, Nadeem ul Haq, whom our Pakistani friends will remember as the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission until recently, and those of us in Sri Lanka remember him as the IMF representative. Now, Nadeem was in Sri Lanka for a conference last month, and he said, you know, in South Asia, we cannot mention the word growth without a qualifying adjective. We talk about sustainable growth or balanced growth or inclusive growth, but we just can't talk about growth. Whereas if you go into a meeting in East or Southeast Asia, they will say, you know, growth is a good thing, we want growth, 8% growth is important. That is not something we seem to find easy to say. It could be, because of course the largest number of the poor people in the world are in South Asia. So that may be the reason. But whatever it is, I think the case I'm going to try to make in this first part of my presentation is that growth is important. Not for the traditional trickle-down kind of paradigm, but for 2 reasons. One is growth is important because it creates the fiscal space. It creates the fiscal space for expenditures on social development. It creates the fiscal space for mitigating action on climate change, on other environmental expenditures. So that is really why I think growth, one of the reasons why I think growth is important, because it means government revenues go up and there is fiscal space for important actions on the social and environmental pillars. Now, interestingly, if you look at India, you get the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, the Right to Education, and now the Food Security Act. None of that would have been possible if India's growth rate hadn't accelerated. India had 8% growth, averaged 8% growth between, I think, 2004 and 2011-12. Now, if that didn't happen, these programs would just not have been possible. Interestingly, I was at a meeting last week where an Indian colleague was saying that the latest survey data in India, the national survey data in India indicates that income poverty has come down significantly and that employment has gone up significantly. But more interestingly, the rate of income poverty coming down and unemployment going up was faster among tribals and scheduled castes than it was for the national average. I mean, that is a very interesting outcome. And I don't think that is because of trickle down. That is because higher growth created the fiscal space for these interventions in terms of the Employment Guarantee Act and of course the Food Security Act is just coming in, but the Right to Education Act. Equally in Brazil, the Bolsa Familia program would not have been possible. Actually, Brazil is a bit different. They initially financed, the Lula government financed the Bolsa Familia program through expenditure switching. But then what they found was that it actually contributed to strengthening growth impulses in the economy because the poor have a higher propensity to spend than the rich. So if you shift resources to the poor, you actually increase domestic demand, and which strengthens the growth potential of the economy. So for those two reasons, for that reason, I would say that growth is important in terms of achieving the objectives on the other two pillars as well. The second point I'd like to make is that growth is associated with transformation of Dr. Bhattacharya alluded to this in his presentation. When we talk about development, what are we talking about? We want to move from, say, low productivity agriculture to low technology manufacturing to traditional services like retail, wholesale trade and transport, etc., to higher productivity agriculture, to higher technology manufacturing and modern services like ICT BPO, financial accountancy services, shipping, aviation, etc. That is what we are trying to do. And when that happens, growth accelerates. And I should say in order to, it's a really a symbiotic process where transformation leads to higher growth, and we are looking for transformation. So for both those reasons, I think growth is important. Of course, the key transmission mechanism for sharing the benefits of growth is employment. So clearly one has to have employment on the radar screen as well. Okay, inequality. I'd like to make 2 points on inequality. It is, as we all know, it's a global phenomenon. In fact, the ADB's, that flagship, I think they call it the Asian Development Outlook report 2 years ago, was on whether or not this century would be the Asian century. And the number one threat that they identified was rising inequality. That is really the threat to really Asian prosperity. Now, there is a structural problem going on in the global economy which is leading to inequality. And that is, with globalization, international capital has become much more mobile. It very aggressively pursues the lowest cost or the most cost-effective destination for production. And what this has led to is that it has reduced the bargaining power of labor. Trade unions have become weaker all around the world. And the share of global national income accruing to labor has declined over the last 2-3 decades, whereas the share to capital has increased significantly. And that is what you're seeing in these kind of inequality numbers that are coming up around the world. So how does one get to kind of win-win situations? I personally feel globalization has created tremendous opportunities. I don't think we throw the baby out with the bathwater, but how do we manage this process in such a way that we have win-win outcomes? On the Kuznetsyan argument, which Asif Memon spoke about, economists say, why you exercised? The inequality is increasing, but the poor time up. Okay, 1 minute, please. The poor are also being lifted up. And so why bother about inequality? And I give 3 reasons. One, of course, there is the equity-based moral argument. 2, again, I think one of the previous speakers referred to that, I think it was Prasanthi, there is a case that increasing inequality leads to social and political instability. So there is that argument. But there is also an argument about economic growth, which I alluded to earlier, and this is, I'd like to address the question raised by our Japanese professor colleague. I go back to the point that the poor spend more. If there is increasing inequality, the amount of money going into the hands of the poor is less, and because they have a higher propensity to spend, what you're really doing is taking domestic demand off the table. And in a world where there is increasing volatility in the global economy, there is a case for building resilience into the growth process by increasing domestic demand. Now, I must say, for Sri Lanka, we need more exports. I'm not saying this is the road forward, because our exports are 17% of GDP. So we have a big problem on the export side. But the principle, the basic point is that with inequality, increasing inequality, you actually are suppressing domestic demand. It's less than it would otherwise be with a more equal income distribution. Finally, on promoting synergies between, to address the tension between growth and natural limits, I think it's important that sustainability issues are mainstream into the planning and budgetary processes, and of course the need to move to triple bottom line accounting. The national accounts have to have sustainability embedded in them. Those are things we need to move towards. Finally, Raghuram Rajan, this rock star central bank governor of the Reserve Bank of India, I think I have great faith in the man, and he made an important point. He said, look, there are a number of reasons why Indian growth has slowed down, but one of the reasons is that because environmental issues, social issues have come to the fore as growth accelerated, it is impossible to get any decisions. On large projects, nothing happens. So he said, look, I'm not saying that these issues are not important, but we've got to get the institutional architecture in place to take quick decisions, to expedite the processes, so that these projects can go ahead. If they're not satisfactory, you throw them out. But you need quick decisions. And what has been happening in India is that things have got stuck. And a lot of large projects have got stuck. They've now got, I think, the Cabinet Committee on Investment, I think, which has been set up to address this. But in our countries, too, I think we see this. We see projects getting stuck because very important issues on the environmental and social side need to be addressed, but we need to find a way of addressing them in an expeditious way to get the institutional framework in place. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I've exceeded my time.
Thank you, Dr. Coomaraswamy. That's not a problem. Before I invite our next discussant, using the fiat and power provided to me as chair, I'd just like to add one thing. As Dr. Coomaraswamy pointed out, that India's certain legislations with regards to employment generation was possibly an outcome of rapid economic growth. In Pakistan, which is where I'm from, we're seeing somewhat an opposite of that. The previous administration introduced an income support program called the Benazir Income Support Program, which was very popular. But now we're talking about its sustainability because it was introduced in the trough of a slowdown in the economy. And so I would agree, growth is important. Otherwise, you can't introduce a lot of these inequality-reducing measures. I'll invite Mr. Deshal, who is with the Haley's Group as a senior economist.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. I, in fact, come from an even more similar background to Indrajith. In fact, I'm more of a corporate background, so I think it will be even more different in that sense. And also that means that we've had fairly similar points, so as Indrajith has stolen most of the things that I was going to say. But no, luckily I have a couple of, just to follow on from what Indrajith pointed out, I think to start with, in terms of creating fiscal space, I completely agree that that growth is required to do that. But I think again its growth is a necessary but not sufficient condition in order to achieve what you want to achieve by creating fiscal space. I think Sri Lanka is a good example of that, in that we've seen a number of programs that have been done targeting particularly poverty alleviation and other areas in terms of environmental and other sustainability issues. But really the problem that we see here is poor targeting in most cases. I think the Samurdhi is an example that is often cited. And really that's a reflection of governance and institutional weakness as well. So creating fiscal space would not have any effect unless you have the right governance framework and the proper institutional framework to be able to translate this into an effective outcome for the entire populace. And what you really need, I believe, is to have a greater degree of transparency and accountability, particularly in your service delivery institutions and in your income transfer programs. Without that, I don't think we are going to have the outcomes that we like to see. The second point Indrajith made with regard to the link between growth and employment, and how that leads to income growth, the population, poverty elevation, and so on. I want to give the example again of Sri Lanka. If you look at Sri Lanka between 2006 and 2012, the economy grew in real terms on average around about 6.5% per annum. But during that same period, if you look at household incomes, real household income growth was 6.1% for the entire 6 years. So that's about 1% per annum. So what we have seen there is your GDP growth has not been translated into household income growth, which is really what is important in terms of livelihoods and welfare of people. A second indicator you can look at is in terms of the growth of the labor market. Again, that same period, 2006-2012, the labor market grew in real terms by 5.9%, right? So that's less than 1% per annum in terms of labor market growth. So we've seen significant economic growth in terms of GDP, but really not translating into creation of jobs and creation of enhanced household incomes. So what is the missing link here? I think one of the major it's multifaceted. There are a number of issues that really will drive the linkage between economic growth and improved welfare. But I think one of the most important ones is in terms of skill endowment, because if you're not creating the kind of jobs that will enable people to make a worthwhile livelihood out of your economic growth, then you're not going to have an impact on individuals. And the main thing here is in terms of, I believe, not just formal education, but also in things like technical, vocational, and other forms of training to give people the skills to be able to take advantage of any growth that is occurring. I think the example was given by the chair earlier about a rising tide that lifts up all the boats. But if your boats don't have good foundations and good structures, they're not going to be able to go up anyway, right? So I think that's important. We need to focus on investment in skill endowments within your population. To pick up on a couple of points that were brought up in the presentations, I think the issue of mispricing, I think, was brought up, and I think that's extremely important. If you look at, for instance, if you want to look at the impact of economic growth on environment and social issues, very often we don't see environmental costs, social costs, and other costs they're not reflected in market prices of products. Let me give you one example. I think in recent times we've seen a number of issues in the garment industry in Bangladesh. And a lot of people were expecting Sri Lankan garment industry to benefit from that, orders to shift to Sri Lanka. But speaking to most of our apparel manufacturers, they say that, look, no, price is really still the bottom line. The buyers really will still, regardless of any environmental issues, even though some orders might go out, they will still focus on the country where you get your lowest cost of production. So there again, I think the onus also comes on to the buyers, right? Consumers in general. We need to also demand certain. We need to be okay with paying a higher price for products and services that take into account the social and environmental costs of the actions. So we can't just blame manufacturers and blame corporates and so on. The onus is on us as well. And I think that it's an evolving, it's a changing thing. I think things are slowly changing, but I think there's clearly a long way to go in that perspective. Coming on to Kanchana's presentation, my former colleague at IPS, I completely agree. I think there's a lot of operational benefits of taking tourism taking a sustainable view to the tourist product that you do. And I think you pointed out issues like energy and the cost implications of that. I think that's spot on. Also, I think you mentioned about the fact that generally hotels that are part of chains tend to have more emphasis on this. I think that is an element again of the influence of having an environmentally conscious product as a brand image. So from a branding perspective, that becomes important as well. And there again, that comes down to your consumer preferences, right? It depends on your target audience. If there are people who value that kind of thing, then you're going to take the effort to do that. Again, the onus comes on to us. Now, the example is in terms of financing. I know that there are a number of financing agencies globally that will provide concessional rates of financing for development of, if you want to expand or refurbishments and so on. Concessional rates of financing, if you have certain environmental covenants that you meet, and then they will also get involved in the monitoring and they will also support you in terms of developing your environmental standards as well. So there are a number of ways in which the sustainable production tourism can be beneficial. Finally, let me just end by talking a little bit about growth and the environment. And really what is important here is if anyone looks at your economic growth from a 20-year horizon or a 30-year horizon as opposed to a 5-year horizon, you will necessarily look at your environmental sustainability of your actions, because it's impossible to grow in the long term without having an environment that's going to support that. And I think the fact that in most of our economies you have 5-year political cycles, it makes it impractical for most governments to be able to actually to take that kind of difficult call on a long 20-30-year planning horizon. And I think that is again an issue in terms of the voters. The voters need to demand that decisions are made that take this trade-off into account between growth and environment. Fortunately, it's not. The aspirations of people are much more short-term in nature. We tend to look at how your life will be in 3 years or in 5 years' time rather than 30 years or 40 years' time or of the next generation. So again, it comes down to us. So I think a lot of the issues that we need to look at from our perspective as consumers, our perspective as voters, and our perspective as players in the economy. And I think that really is that kind of advocacy, that kind of knowledge creation would be essential to take this agenda forward. Okay, let me end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Deshal. And I'll invite our last discussant, Ms. Dissanaike, who is an independent consultant and works on sustainable development and environmental policy.
Thank you. Yes, so I don't come from an economic background, so I'll be the odd one out in the discussion panel. I want to take the discussion away from growth a little bit and reflect more on some things that Dr. Prasanthi Gunawardene threw out and also expand on that. So I think looking back at the Sustainable Development Agenda, Rio and onwards, we've forgotten, the forgotten principle is the intergenerational equity. There is a principle there entrenched in the Sustainable Development discussion that we shouldn't forget the next generation when we are growing now. Now, Dr. Gunawardene said that the neoclassical theory, economic theory, growth theory is that if you ensure the prosperity of the future generation, it justifies depleting the resources we have now because you're building some kind of capital, some kind of human physical capital that might even replace natural capital. But this is being proven wrong all the time, and there are certain, as she said, certain environmental processes that are irreversible. So climate change is upon us. We all know that. We discuss this in a very abstract form, and sometimes we think it's upon us when it gets too hot during the day or when it rains at all the odd times and the seasons change and the cultivation patterns go haywire. But these have real economic costs, and this is being recognized over and over. So this concept, this idea of leaving resources for the next generation has to be entrenched into whatever goals that come next, because that is the only way we set ourselves, as Andrew Scott said, on a path to sustainability, on the right way. So not to forget this underlying principle is the first point. So coming back to that, I mean, we have a folklore in Sri Lanka, a story about an old man planting a tree, and the little boy asks, "Why are you planting this tree? It's a seed." So he says, it'll grow into a tree. But he says, "But you're old. You won't be there when it grows up." He said, "It's not for me. It's for the birds. It's for the earth. It's for you when you grow up." So it's a very simplistic story, but it shows that in our cultures, we didn't think of growing now. We always thought of saved for and looked at the future and saving something for the generations to come. But I think in this whole enthusiasm for growth and well-being now and the consumption opportunity we have now, lots of this concept is forgotten. another thing is coming to sustainable consumption and production. A very good theory, and it's very abstract at the moment. I mean, we have tools like ecological footprint, carbon footprint. We have things to measure what we consume, how we produce, but how many corporates use that? How many governments ask their corporates, their agriculturists to use these tools? Even people. I mean, we can measure our carbon footprint, but these are very westernized, not very South Asian tools that are on the web. But it'll be interesting to develop something that we can use in the region that is relevant to us when we are developing to ensure that minimum needs are met. But beyond that, beyond necessity, as Dr. Gunawardene was saying, beyond necessity, there should be a cost, a real cost tagged to the usage of natural resources. Basically, how do we incentivize sustainable consumption and production? That's kind of I'd just like to see some discussion on that. And how do we value non-renewable resources and how we use it? Are the real costs, tagged there? And then equity and ethics, I think somebody in the morning said we should think out of the box, but it's not really out of the box in our region. It's very much within the box in our region to be thinking of development in a different way, because we have our religions, our cultures that have guided us, that have deified natural resources. We used to worship Hinduism, Buddhism. We worship a large tree. A natural landscape of great beauty is actually something to be valued beyond its utilitarian value. So, or its tourism potential, or it is something spiritual. So, it'll be difficult to go back to very basic roots, but dredging something out of that heritage would be interesting way to look at it. And there was a discussion in the morning about development governance should be non-normative and everyday, local, making governance locally responsible and locally relevant is important, because right now we are being governed by central governments, provincial councils, or state governments we don't even relate to. We don't know who's really representing us. So making governance locally relevant in the next development agenda, so that people have a voice, people have a say about what they give up in terms of development. I want to tell you a story about it's something I heard Sri Lanka. I think some of you who have come to Sri Lanka in the last 2 days would have traveled on the new expressway to Colombo. Now, we didn't have this a week ago. Now we have it. It's great, actually, to be able to come from the airport in, 20 minutes up to the bridge. But a person living in a village close by said, bicycles, motorcycles are not allowed on it. So she said, well, my family only has a motorcycle, and we can't go on it. And I'm just thinking the cost of this, how many of my future generations will pay for this road that is there, and to carry whom? I will never get to travel on it. So that really, I was so happy that it came, because I commute from that side of the town, and now every time I go on it, I think of what she said. And then there's this question of equity, where growth is important, that development is important to Sri Lanka as a whole, but, the trickle down. Prasanthi showed us the trickle down, and it hasn't trickled down to where we want it to. So, yeah, those are the 3 points I want to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dissanaike. Before I open up the floor for questions, I don't know whether everybody's noticed this or not, but I have. We have sort of 2 groups in this panel, in this session. We have the economists and the pro-growth. We understand it needs to be categorized and adjectivized and so on. And then there's a critique of that. So let's see if we can, through our discussion, bring the 2 groups closer together in agreement on some issues. Yes, please.
That's quite an ambitious.
Can you hear me? Right. Just to say that I'm straddling both groups now. Okay? So I'm not going to be in either box because I'm an environmental economist and a sustainability professional. And I really do believe that we can have better growth and environmentally friendly growth, which is really the camp of the kind of sustainability looking at all the dimensions. I call it ESG, but environmental, social, and governance kind of issues. And I'd just like to congratulate both the presenters as well as the discussants. I thought it was a really rich and multidimensional kind of a presentation and discussion, and it touched so many of the points. So I'm going to kind of very quickly touch on a couple of things that people said and expand a little bit on what I think perhaps should also be heard. You know, we've heard from Dr. Gunawardene about how the 5,000 hectares a year are disappearing. That's reason for despair in all our countries. We're losing a lot of irreplaceable resources. There's no question about it. But we've also heard of the kind of signs of hope. So the SCP, or the Sustainable Consumption and Production, is one of the kind of part of the model of sustainability that is being advocated, but it has serious limitations also. We all know about diminishing returns, and we all know that all these energy efficiencies have limits and declining potentials as we exploit them. So embedding sustainability in organizations takes a much more transformational role, which we need to call for. And we do have very, I would say, increasingly vocal and disparate groups, consumer groups, producer groups, who are looking at green growth, who are looking at eco-innovation, who are looking at eco-efficiencies, who would really like, who are contributing to this. And to touch upon a point that Anila made this morning about the fact that we need to get, you know, the high-end people's lifestyles also changing. I mean, there are, for example, the Lifestyle for Health and Sustainability conferences, which hold an annual conference. It's called LOHAS. And this is something that goes around the world. In 2012, they were in Singapore. Next year, they are in Colorado. These are kind of showcasing how companies can also benefit from consumers who are looking at a different kind of consumption, more quality and not so much on the quantitative side, and you know, different kinds of models of development or a developed kind of economy and spending pattern. I'd also just like to say that, you know, there are lots of studies which show that there is a willingness to pay for environmental attributes in goods and services, and so that there, you know, in the economic literature there is that, and we need to kind of exploit that a little bit more and show that to producers. I also think that you know, innovation is very much key in all this, and being able to innovate and being able to move out of a very dirty kind of industry into something which is a lot cleaner, and being able to have the technologies and the know-how and the will to do that is something that is very important. But I'd like to also get to the point which somebody mentioned as a discussant, I think, which really talked about incentivizing things. I mean, I think we really need to call for the economic or market-based incentives for sustainability. For example, in India, it has taken the form of RECs in the energy industry, where we're looking at renewable energy certificates and a kind of a mini Kyoto program, which has sparked off renewable energy investment in an unprecedented scale, and has made these investments and the ROIs and the kind of economic IRRs made it very viable now to invest in renewable energy by the private sector. So we have these kinds of regulatory policies which can also play a role. We also have to look at the marketing side, where we're looking at pulling out these environmental attributes of goods and services and being able to brand goods and services so that people value them and will buy them. We also need to look at valuing environmental goods and services, including use of resources and the waste that we create. Now we see this trend happening with sustainability reporting. We have organizations, and this is not limited to the private sector, looking at actually measuring what their water, what their consumption of natural resources are, and including it in balance sheets. So this is another trend that we are seeing, which really needs to be highlighted and promoted and incentivized, because I think this is the way, the new way of moving ahead with growth, but also something which benefits not just the social side, but also the environmental side.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah. My intervention is not exactly on these interventions by the panelists, but in the context of the ongoing process in New York. So when we talk about growth and employment, by and large, people are talking about even in the consultation run up to the HLP reports shows that growth should be inclusive, but at the same time, what are we looking at? We are looking at the state should have some policy space to determine its growth trajectory. Second, we are looking at more of a decent jobs. So how will you provide that job? And third, the role of government in the public goods. And also, how do we create much more framework to address the global public good mechanism? So these are some of the points we are looking at. But for me, I think the center point is the policy space. Because these debates, these discussions are happening on one side, but on the other side, maybe next month in Bali, we will be moving forward to another trajectory where the trade facilitation is an important issue in which it will end up as a kind of an import facilitation agreement, or even people are talking about global value chains. So in that context, so you have two, you will be left with less policy space to determine your own growth strategies and trajectories. So it's important to insist on policy space, and the current, this morning it is pointed out that the current investment rules or the intellectual property rights or even the trade rules does not support enough or does not provide enough policy space for a developing country to address some of these issues. For instance, if you impose a tax on any of these sustainable development strategies, it may violate in some of your bilateral investment treaty obligations, and you might be asked to pay a lot of compensation for the investor. And two more points. The second one is that some trade unions have pointed out to address on the decent job aspect when we are talking about more and more on global value chains, etc. A minimum floor, minimum wage, Asian floor wage in the garment industry context, it has come up often. So it's also a good idea to look at that aspect. And thirdly, India has been mentioned a lot. And India is an example where the you can see that the growth growth at the cost of for the sake of growth should not happen. So India's growth story, basically the 8% growth happened from 2004 to 2010, and it's by and large financed through a debt financing. And now the country has ended up with a huge current account deficit and along with a huge trade deficit. And people are thinking that it may get into a kind of a red zone sometime in 2015. So it's important to look at this, what went wrong, and to move forward. And also one more thing is that the employment, the growth never created employment in India. Especially it was a jobless growth by and large. All statistics are from the government. It shows that it was a jobless growth. So it's important we should keep these things in mind.
Thank you. Just a second, I have 3 questions waiting. Do any of the panelists want to respond to that set of questions? Sir, you wanted to ask a question.
No, I think it's a very good panel. I will not spend my very valuable time in complimenting the presenters and the discussants. Please take it to be given or read in that way. I have two issues in that way. You see, the objective of this particular meeting, why we were interested, both as CPD and Southern Voice, is that one is because of Priyanthi's challenge of thinking differently. So I'm waiting for that difference in that way to go take it back home. I don't know how it will be packaged. And the other was to connecting the South Asian discourse regarding, particularly regarding the environmental concerns to the, what is happening at the international forum. That is the second part in that way. Now, my first point is that the presentation, to that extent I have heard, and others, in general, it's an observation, generic observation. You see, why the growth wallas do not get, do not meet, the meeting of minds doesn't happen with those who are environment wallas, is basically because there is lack of deeper understanding and research and I think exploration of the causality of what are the poverty implications, growth-related poverty implications for sustainable development, or sustainable development, what would it mean in terms of life changes in livelihood conditions. So at best we get that what the research currently is there, that if the climate change happens in terms of both rainfalls or in terms of increase in temperature, what would be the yield rate in agriculture and etc. At best on a sectoral level. But relating it to what would happen to wage employment, what happens to the self-employment categories, or to various categories of subsistence farmer, those issues have not been adequately researched. Now, in some way, the tourism discourse is maybe will be able to take it downwards in that way, in the micro-level discussion. So my first appeal to all is that if we are looking for a future issue for research on post-2015, then one of the major area would be that what are the job or employment or poverty-related implications of the sustainability goals which are being promoted in one way, or the growth-related goals which has been promoted, and what are the sustainability implications in that way, including competitiveness, along with that. The second point, just give me a minute, is that, you see, all of us, we are complaining that environment is not being taken care of. But none of you really refer to the indicators or the proposals which are on table. And I mentioned in the morning, it is water, it is energy, it is about natural resources, it is about land use. None of you really gone through those and really got into the indicators and goals and say these are not acceptable to us. Rather, what would also come out, now I am very happy the sustainable consumption issue has come up, but also in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions and other issues. So I think if you want to add something, then you need to scratch on what is really on the table instead of something out there which is very virtual and not tangible in that way and beyond our means. So I will appeal once again to go back to the table, see what is on the table, what is being offered, and how inadequate it is. The last point. Now, how to really deal with it? Somebody mentioned the market mechanism, pricing. Pricing is one of the ways of dealing with it. We are talking of various measures, and the other is possibly the command control methods which are usually applied. We all know that we need to go for market-based controls in that way. The issue is, nobody is really emphasizing that many of these issues cannot be done nationally. Take the example of fossil fuel. If you do away with your fossil fuel subsidies, and the rest of the world, United States, doesn't do anything about it, how you're going to end up in the world in terms of selling your goods and also your consumption, the cost of living, so how it will happen. So you also look at the border measures, the carbon taxes. Can you really implement them at your own borders where the rest of the world is not doing? European Union is learning it to its own peril. Third, standards. Standards is a non-tariff barrier, or it is really an ecologically motivated, fair decision. We need to get into the concrete things, and instead of really going back to those general principles, where I think this House remains completely convinced. Thank you.
Thank you. Any responses from the panel to those series of questions? With apologies to the upcoming questioners, I'll ask them to limit themselves to one question, please. We'll begin with this gentleman in the striped shirt, and then after that, Mr. Bassett.
Thanks very much. Well, fortunately, Dr. Bhattacharya has made some of the points that I wanted to make, which was to try and bring the discussion back to the question of the post-2015 framework. just one observation, which I'll just lay it on the table, and you can take of it what you will. But I find it very interesting to have a discussion about growth that doesn't mention green growth, which is the narrative that is current, certainly in Europe and North America. My question really is the same as Dr. Bhattacharya's, which is in the post-2015 framework. How would sustainable consumption and production be featured? It is not currently part of any proposal, and it's almost a topic that the Open Working Group wants to avoid discussing, simply because it is actually highly politically motivated in terms of the implications both for rich and southern countries. And I suppose the second part of the question is to take into account, if we are talking about a set of goals that are universally applicable to all countries, we need to consider what they say about growth and what that then means, not just for countries in South Asia, but countries in Europe and North America.
Thank you. Panel. I have a few comments or responses, but I'll come to those after. Basis up.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Abdul Basit Khan. I'm Executive Director, National Institute of Population Studies in Pakistan. And we are conducting the surveys on the population, and we are providing the information to the policymakers with reference to the two important MDGs, that is child mortality and improvement of maternal health as well. But a lot of things has been said, and I think a very good presentation, I would say it. But population is a very important subject in Pakistan, and we need to draw some attention to this as well, because as we understand, the population in the world increased in the 20th century from 1.6 to about 6.1%. That 20th century witnessed not only the increase in the population, that also witnessed the increase in the growth rate as well. And the growth rate was, I think, 22 to 30 times more than the population growth rate. The question arises that this population is good for the country or not. And since our country is blessed with the aging, with the young population, so what theory, as Asif was telling about, that says that we need to control this vicious circle or vicious trend of population, this overpopulation. And that is good for one's country. But at the same time, this market theory also says that this rising income also reduces the this rising income also reduces the population also. But I don't think that this is good for the developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
I think the issue I would just like to put on the table is whether we really want to talk about taking something like suggesting growth within limits to be a goal or a principle. This was something that was actually suggested in the SDNS goals. They suggested growth within planetary limits. If you look at the MDGs as they are now, they don't talk about that kind of growth. They break the environmental issues into energy, water, managing natural resources, but it doesn't link it to what is happening with the economy. The economics is looked at trying to generate inclusive growth. So my question to all of you is whether we think that there is a necessity to ask or say that, you know, we do need to put in a goal about growing better, like Kiran suggested, or growing within limits, or is it possible, it is not?
Thank you. This is not aimed as a wrap-up of the session, but just a few points to respond to. Then maybe some of the panelists can jump in. The panelists have been unusually shy in the question and answer session. Everybody who's raised questions has pointed out, especially Dr. Bhattacharya, that there are trade-offs, obviously, that we have to discuss about, and we have to talk about them in real sense. I know a lot of our discussion has been abstract, but for example, there are lots of organizations out there that are currently analyzing the economic and profit potential of the melting of the northern ice cap. Oil possibilities, drilling for oil, shipping lines, who controls what, whether it's Canada or the Scandinavian countries or Russia. And discussions like this will continue. In a sense, capitalism is to some extent amoral about these issues, or value neutral about these issues. I think there is a need for, instead of stating that we need to focus more on reducing the degeneration of natural resources, which is important, but we need to talk about what impact that will have on the average income of the lowest decile of our population. If we look at the US, for example, over the last few years, one of the worst economic crises in that country's history, which has led to a large percentage of the population, or a significant percentage of their population, moving into long-term unemployment, which I'm sure we would all agree is not a good outcome. We would see that because of that, the possible carbon footprint of that country has reduced, or not increased at the same rate it would have if they had continued to grow at the same rate. So there are genuine trade-offs here, and quite correctly pointed out by our friend at ODI, which is the possible solution to that Gordian knot is the discussion about green growth, the discussion about renewable energy, cost of renewable energy going down. I'm just looking at a calculation here which talks about the cost of producing 1 watt of electricity through solar panels in 1977 was $77 per kilowatt hour, and now is about 80 cents. And there's talk about further reduction in those costs. So specific policy details, specific trade-offs that need to be discussed, whether it affects, talking about the space between international agreements and how they reduce the policy space for a specific country. But then do we want a piecemeal solution that's regional and country specific and not universal? What issues are universally resolved or need to be resolved at a global level, and what issues need to be addressed at a local level? So I think there's a need for greater specificity, as Dr. Bhattacharya pointed out in our discourse. Please, Deshal.
Just to add a couple of things, I think the point was made about incentives, and I think that is certainly very important, and I think that's the best way to get basically businesses engaged in this much more. To give you one example, if you look at, for instance, energy generation in Sri Lanka, if you look at the differential between the tariff paid on a unit of wind power and that of general thermal energy, it's at least 4 or 5 times higher to get for wind power, and that really is what's required to compensate for the investment that goes in to generate that. Now, of course, wind power has its own kind of issues, but we have seen much more interest by corporates to invest in wind power. We've also seen, and also the government also has a target to have. I think at least 10% of Sri Lanka's energy generation from non-conventional renewable energy sources. So that is things like wind, biomass, solar, and so on. And still there's a long way to go. But I think those tariff structures are one example of how to go about it in a way that that is more sustainable. And the role of technology as well. I think that is one thing that Mr. Memon just pointed out. There again. There are ways that through national budgeting processes you can provide incentives for investment in these kind of technologies. We don't see that enough you don't see that enough, at least in Sri Lanka. I think there's room for doing that to a greater extent. And also the point was brought out about much more green accounting coming into companies' annual reports and so on, where there is a more emphasis taken on the social and environmental costs of your production activities. And I think one thing that we can look at is to try to at least quantify some of those social and environmental costs of particular goods. That's not an easy thing to do. But if you're not going to have that incorporated in a direct manner in your market price, at least to have some way of evaluating it from a quantifiable perspective and add it to the labeling or something along those lines, so that people at least have more understanding of the real cost of what is being consumed. And I just want to agree with Dr. Bhattacharya about the difficulties in finding global agreements. Well, the importance and difficulties in finding global agreements on things like competitiveness and compromise, when different countries absorb different costs of taking on different measures. So it really won't work unless you have broader global and multilateral agreements on these, and I think that has to really be the priority.
Yeah, a few points as responses. Actually, again, I mean, standing still on my the limiting growth platform, the importance of growth has been highlighted again. But actually speaking, what we are measuring as the improved wealth or whatever maybe the national income is actually the decreasing welfare in terms of the real terms. I mean, for example, we have this nice example from USA, which is highlighted as the most growing economy in the world. They have estimated the actual welfare improvement for the country using this index called the Sustainable Economic Welfare, ISEW, and they found for the last 30 years the USA economy is going down. There were certain questions about this innovation and the green kind of production, but also, I mean, the literature highlights that there is this cancelling effect, because whenever people find that they are consuming a greener product, they tend to consume more of it. So finally you end up in the original back to zero. And the other one is this importance of valuation of, I mean, the environmental aspects, the benefits plus the cost. But still the problem still is actually in relation to the focus. I mean, we focus on the current generation. Whatever value is going to the future, we discount using high discount rate. In the context of Sri Lanka, something like 10%. So whatever future cost and benefits will be devalued, we may never be able to justify environmentally friendly projects, and we'll be easily justifying the environmentally harmful projects. I would prefer that if you could give a straightforward answer to the Karin's question, that whether we should be including this green, the limitations as a kind of a parameter to this the next set of goals we are going to develop. But of course, I think in my point of view, we don't have choice. Like, it should be there, must. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, just to add to it, and following from what Dr. Bhattacharya said and Karin's question, maybe we should think from this session that we would take back, if we are to take back something, that we would actually formulate or propose something on sustainable consumption and production, which encapsulates then that growth has to be limited in a way or rationalized, that both consumption and production has to be within some norms and some limits. So I'm not sure how the technicality of actually sort of proposing this or formulating this, but I mean, I think that's what sort of is coming from you, and the economists, they do believe that there is a limit to this. Yes.
Yeah, in terms of the corporate sector, I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, the small scale industries, especially the SMEs, should be received a greater attention, especially because when it comes to energy issues, one of the major issues in the SME sector in Sri Lanka is the high energy cost. So I'm not sure whether they would be okay to go for sustainable energy options if they have like the energy issues for their day-to-day operation in their day-to-day operations. And Deshal mentioned that the corporate sector has shown an increased interest in regard to green accounting. And I should also mention that Sri Lanka also has the Ministry of Environment in Sri Lanka has initiated a green accounting project, and Dr. Prasanthi is a key person in that task. And in that one also, I think they are going to value the economic growth or the economic output while incorporating the natural resource concerns, which includes degradation as well. So might be they are still at the initial stage, but after some time I think they might be able to come up with good figures that are important in policy preparations.
Thank you. Pri, you had a comment or question?
Yeah, I've been feeling a little bit uncomfortable because I think there is a sort of feeling that we are saying throw growth out. I mean, nobody's saying that. I don't think we, I mean, even if we wanted to, I don't think we think it's possible. But and I don't think we even want to. So that's, I think that needs to be put on the table. I think what we're trying to say is that growth needs to happen, and as like Kiran pointed out, growth needs to happen in a way that is both socially and environmentally responsible. And that what the way we see growth happening now is that responsibility is perhaps not filled. And just to think about more sort of practical ways of rethinking the whole idea, I just thought maybe we could go back to, because it was going around in my head and I really didn't know where to get some support for this. So I went back to the UN NGO consultation, that UN NGLS documentation. And in there, they talk about issues like protecting the global commons. So some kind of definite, I mean, maybe it is a principle, but maybe it can get translated into some kind of goal so that we work on protecting global commons, that is the common resources that we all need for a certain level of, it talks about food sovereignty, which is slightly different, I think, of a concept of than food security. So it's about people having control over their food production rather than, having control. And it also talks about the polluter pays principle, which we may not be, some of us may not be that comfortable with, but it still is a principle that has been which is the sort of environmental, climate change accounting kind of principles, where the person who, and I think we've talked about it here, but the people who use the resources actually pay the full cost of it. So I think there are certain trends happening in this conversation, that all these multiple conversations that are happening, that we really probably need to also bring into this discussion.
Thank you, Pri. Going forward, sorry, somebody had a question or a comment? Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow on a little bit from what Priyanti's just said. I do sense that at the moment, though, that when we're talking about growth, the discussion has moved on from where it was a decade or 2 decades ago. Before, economic growth seemed to be the single most important policy objective of any government. It came before anything to do with social objectives or environmental objectives, and economic growth was paramount. I think the discussion here this morning suggests that perhaps that has moved on, and that we are seeing economic growth as being a means to the broader social objectives. And that in itself, I think, is quite significant. When we get, though, to the question of the growth within planetary boundaries, to use the phrase from the Stockholm Environment Institute, and to be honest, it would be the same when we're talking about national boundaries. I think we come up against a critical question there, which is once you start saying that there is if you like, a defined quantity of environmental services, and in fact the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has just said that there is 1 trillion, scope for 1 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. We've already exceeded half of that. And the question then becomes, well, how do we share out the rest of it? And that becomes the same when you're talking about other kinds of boundaries. The question then immediately becomes, well, how do we get our fair share of that? Which takes us back immediately, I think, to the fundamental principle that we also need to be thinking about in terms of the post-2015 framework, which is how we want to see equity and fairness built into that framework, both at levels of principle and narrative, but also at levels of targets and indicators.
Thank you, teacher.
Lady over there wanted first.
Please,
I'm in the queue.
Sorry, I missed you.
Thank you. Again, listening to the discussion, it seems, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, we've moved beyond looking at just economic growth, and I think everybody recognizes the issues, but also, I mean, and Dr. Bhattacharya has been continuing to tell us, focus on what can be done with what's on the table. But then you see that there's so much deviation in terms of what is required by any one country and what the priorities are. Now, if you compare Sri Lanka, now in the case of Sri Lanka, say with the MDGs, we were beyond some of the MDGs, so we created our own goals at that time because, for example, primary school education, we already had whatever was required. So it seems that it's very difficult to identify the universal problems are the same, but the goals could be different. So one way to approach it could be that you identify the issues and then each country says, okay, this is what I set for myself within those parameters and I will achieve this, and it will be very different from the industrialized world, which is now finding its own new problems coming up. The growth shift has moved to another part of the world, to the countries that have very, very basic problems. So it may be time learning from the experience of the MDGs, where you had the very simplistic goals which enable people to focus, but they went there, achieved it in different ways, to recognizing that you agree to, I won't use the word disagree, to deviate and have a different set of requirements within a framework. The other thing that hasn't come up is the impact of media in today's revolution on thinking. And it may be also important on the sustainability issue to see in global fora what can be put in, as an example, the tobacco lobby, you have to say, this is injurious to your health on every cigarette packet. So even in the media, to, plug the two aspects. One is in international fora, you recognize that the media has a role to play and you use that avenue for raising awareness. The other thing is at an international level, you accept that, okay, this is for long term, not for this generation, for the future. That every country agrees that in its primary school curricula, there will be a certain, module on sustainability, whether it comes to water, energy, whatever. So that at least the new generations, they are targeted to recognize these issues. So there are many different ways you can do it, but I think from the discussion, it seems clear that it would be very, very hard to find very specific goals that are relevant to each country in the same way. So I think that's something that will have to be recognized.
Yes. No, I fully appreciate the things what Dr. Andrew Scott has just mentioned. We didn't rehearse amongst ourselves in supporting each other. That much I can ensure. First point, what is a planetary boundary? Because the boundary is shifting. I think there is no absolute on that. Soon maybe we'll be bringing water from Mars, rare metals from Venus, God knows, or from somewhere else. No, why are you laughing? You have no faith in space travel? Our chairperson has just mentioned how the cost of unit production cost of solar power has decreased. Just remember how much it used to cost in terms of your telephone calls earlier, or the digital watch in that sense. So that is something which we keep in mind, that the planetary boundary is shifting. I'm not saying it's happening tomorrow, but it is shifting. The second point, I think is very good point in that way, that how do you really accommodate national priorities within a universal framework? It will essentially mean that we will take a hard look at our environmental agenda and tell that these are the issues which we cannot resolve ourselves, for which we need global collective action. And these are the issues which are very much within the domain of our national governments or local governments or individual livelihood, household conduct, social behavior, which we can do that. So I think this is a task for the environmental developmentalist approach to discern which is exclusively a global one and which are national and if not regional. So and regional issue is also important. I'm finding it surprising it never came up till now in terms of watershed management and other issues as well, or melting of glaciers in the Everest and everything else. So this is the second point. The third point is that, you see, this is in response to Karen and all others in that way. Developing ourselves within the planetary boundary cannot be a goal. It is a principle. It is a principle. It's a cross-cutting principle which goes through all other things. So now, in order to reflect that goal, reflect that principle, we need to have goal. Now, experience has taught us that there is given the multidimensionality of the problem, it is very difficult to contain this whole multidimensionality in one goal. So that's why it is all spread across 4 or 5 goals within the 12 or a dozen or so what we are going to have. So don't look for a goal. There are the goals. So this is the second point, third point on these goals issues. The third is that once we have those goals, it is important to look whether we are having the right indicators there, reflecting there. So whether the targets are there, what is achievable, or it is ambitious enough, is it reflecting our possibilities, and etc. And then the measurable indicator, that will be important. But what is more important, which we have not discussed enough, apart from talking about incentives and sometimes about the pricing, command control methods, or other market-based instrument, is what are the instruments at our disposal? What are the instruments at our disposal to address those issues? Do we suffer from any other shortfall of instruments, or are we innovative enough to create a new instrument? Now, the public policy theory will tell you that you cannot have more objectives than the number of instruments you have. So this is a challenge now to do that metrics and see that whether each of these goals are adequately addressed through instruments, and those instruments will be again related, this is the feedback loop, to those global collective actions and what are on the national level policy measures or institutional measures. Some of them will be policy relevant, some of them are structural in nature. Now those which are structural in nature, whether there is any other forms of intervention which will improve that structural nature. There we will come in with the state level intervention, the transfer of funds, how do you really change the terms of conditions or the terms of trade and other issues over there in the global governance. So my appeal to you all is again to think through more, not only in a lock frame format, but also how do we translate these principles from these grandfather type of statements into goals, and goals into targets, which targets are South Asian feasible targets, and then to the indicators, and then obviously the policy measures or instruments, interventions, which will really make them feasible both at the global and the national level. Thank you for this time for the second time.
Thank
I
you.
hope it was unsustainable use of the time.
Thank you. I'll just, apologies to anyone who was still planning on asking a question. We've slightly run over time. I'll close this session with just a couple of things. One, it's important to not, as mentioned by a few people, with regard, and also also mentioned this, to not throw the growth baby out with the bathwater. There are examples of this happening in different parts of the world. Sometimes the idea that carbon footprints have a bad impact can lead to sort of a crass kind of nativism, and globalization and trade liberalization has brought us lots of benefits. I'll just use as an example, in some Western countries, there's a greater tendency towards buying local produce, which measurably harms poor farmers from developing countries, because it replaces their products to locally produced products that provide subsidy, that are profitable only because of subsidies provided by wealthy country governments. That's one example. A second issue, and I think Dr. Gunawardene has raised this, and this is a challenge to the economists, is how we count GDP. For example, she mentioned that an increase in pollution could lead to an increase in health expenditure, which would actually show as an increase in GDP based on our calculation. So that's a very good challenge. And also, how do we count how much more CO2 emissions the country, what is the limit, what are the planetary limits? I've just done a brief calculation. I believe on this trip, I have already contributed more than 300 kilograms of CO2 to the environment. And I'll close that on that session, on that note. Thank you very much.